Hey everyone, what's going on? Welcome back to Babylon Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Pei Hey, Daf 85 of Masechta Pesachim. The Daf begins with the machlokas between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish regarding breaking the bones of a korban pesach. When we kind of touched on it yesterday a little bit, when there's like meat in one part of the bone, but no meat in the other part of the bone. Very, very exciting sugya that we're going to start off with. This kind of somehow leads into a machlokas, a question really, which ends with a teku, about if there's tumas yodayim for meat that leaves the hazara. Okay, interesting question. And then we get to a new Mishnah on Daf Pei Amud Beis, where we talk a little bit about the walls of Jerusalem, which is kind of interesting in terms of Kachim Kalam, but also Mitzoras. It's kind of interesting, I think. Let's get started. We're on Daf Pei Dalet Amud Beis, like 5-6 lines from the bottom, Itmar. Kind of in the middle of the line. 2, 4, 6 lines from the bottom. A little bit past the middle of the line. Itmar, it was stated, Eiver she'ein olav kizayis basar b'makom zeh, v'yesh olav kizayis basar b'makom acher. So we're talking about you have a bone, you have like a limb of a korban, and dafka the korban pesach, and the limb does not have any meat in one part of it, but in another part of it, let's say, sort of like towards one end of it, but towards the other end of it, there is a kazayis of meat. Alright? And you want to break it in the part of the bone where there's no kazayis of meat. And the question is, will that be a violation of ve'etzem lo sish birubo, that you're not allowed to break the bones of a korban pesach? We discussed yesterday that it has to be ro'i la'achila. If you have, let's say, certainly if you have a bone that doesn't have any meat on it, bichlal, that there's just nothing to eat on it, well then there won't be a violation of breaking a bone. But what about a bone that part of it has meat and part of it doesn't have meat, and you break it in the part that doesn't have meat? Would that be a problem? So, Rabbi Yochanan Amar says, Rabbi Yochanan, yesh bo mishum shviras ha'etzem, it will be a problem. Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish Amar, ein bo mishum shviras ha'etzem. Whereas Reish Lakish says that it will be okay, and we're going to explain sort of both opinions. So, Eisvei Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish. So, Rabbi Yochanan asks a kasha from a brisa against Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish. And here's the brisa, that the pasuk says, Ve'etzem lo sish berubo, that you're not allowed to break any bones of the korban pesach. Now, echad etzem sheish olav kazayis basar, ve'echad etzem she'ein olav kazayis basar, and that is the brisa. The brisa says that when the pasuk says Ve'etzem lo sish berubo, that you're not allowed to break any bones of the korban pesach, that means whether it's a bone that has meat on it, or whether it's a bone that does not have meat on it. That's what the brisa says, and kind of leaves it up to us to figure out what exactly that means. Now, explains my ein olav kazayis basar. Now, I understand why it would be a problem to break a bone that has a kazayis of basar on it, because you can be eating it, and because you can be eating that bone, you're not allowed to break it. It's ro'i la'achila, you can't break the bone. Now, when we say that there's no meat on it, you're not allowed to break it, what exactly do we mean by there's no meat on it? Ilema, if we take it at face value, dein olav kazayis basar klal, meaning pashit, a bone that doesn't have any meat on it. Not on it, not in it, nothing to do with it. Well then, forget about the fact that I said in it. We'll get to that in a minute, but let's say on it, to keep things simple for now. If we're talking about a bone that doesn't have any meat on it at all, well then what's the problem in terms of shviras ha'etzem? So rather, says Rabbi Yochanan, it must be that when the brisa feels the need to tell us that even a bone that has no meat on it, you're still not allowed to break it. It means echad etzem sheish olav kazayis basar b'makom zeh, ve'echad she'ein olav kazayis basar b'makom zeh, ve'esh olav kazayis basar b'makom acher. So rather, explains Rabbi Yochanan, you know what it means when the brisa says that even a bone that doesn't have any meat, you're still not allowed to break it? It's not talking about a bone that doesn't have any meat at all. If it has no meat at all, then what's the problem with breaking it? it's talking about a bone that doesn't have any meat at all in one specific place, but it does have meat in another place. And still, the Brisa is saying that you're not allowed to break it. That is Rabbi Yochanan's kasha against Rish Lakish. Basically, he's saying to Rish Lakish, no, Rish Lakish, if you're saying that a bone that has no meat in one place, but has meat in another place, you would be allowed to break it in the part that doesn't have any meat on it, well then how do you explain this Brisa that feels the need to tell us that a bone that doesn't have any meat, you're still not allowed to break it? If it doesn't have any meat at all, then why can't I break it? It must mean, says Rabbi Yochanan, the only way you can explain this Brisa must be to say that we're talking about a bone that doesn't have meat at all in this place, but has meat in another place, and still you're not allowed to break that. Nu Rish Lakish. So Rish Lakish responds to Rabbi Yochanan, and he says, Hachi Ka'amar. This is what the Brisa is saying. No, whether we're talking about a bone that has a kazayis of meat on the outside, however, so says Rish Lakish, no, what that Brisa means is whether there's meat on the outside, or whether there's no meat on the outside, but there's meat on the inside. You're going to be chayav if you break the bone. However, if you break the bone in a place where there's no meat at all, not on the outside, not on the inside, you're going to be pater, argues Rish Lakish, even though there's meat on some other part of the bone. All right, but says Rish Lakish, kilu. So maybe slightly differently than we initially thought. Meaning, if you have a bone and there's meat on one part of it, but on the other part of it there's no meat on it, according to Rish Lakish, you still might be chayiv if you break the other part if there's marrow inside of it, right? What Rish Lakish is saying, if you find a part of the bone that has no meat at all, not meat on the outside, not marrow on the inside, then you would be pater. V'atanya, we learn in a Brisa, Ve'etzem lo sishbru bo. This is an interesting Brisa, that the pasuk says that you're not allowed to break any bones of the korban pesach. Okay. Echad etzem sheyesh bo moach, ve'echad etzem she'ein bo moach. Now, this means whether the bone has marrow in it, or whether the bone does not have marrow in it, you're not allowed to break it. Now, umani mekayim v'achlos abaso b'layla zev. But one second, we have a pasuk. And while we have one pasuk that says you're not allowed to break any of the bones, we have another pasuk that says v'achlos abasu b'layla azeh, that you got to eat the meat of the korban pesach. And therefore, if you got to eat all of the meat of the korban pesach, so then I can argue that it even includes the marrow. You got to eat the marrow. Now, if you got to eat the marrow, I should be able to break the bones in order to extract the marrow, right? So let's start again from the beginning of the Brisa, right? Ve'etzem lo sishbru bo, that the pasuk says you're not allowed to break any bones, and this means echad etzem sheyesh bo moach, ve'echad etzem she'ein bo moach. Whether the bone has marrow, whether the bone doesn't have marrow. But if we're saying that even a bone that has marrow in it, you're not allowed to break it, well then, umani mekayim v'achlos abasu b'layla azeh. Well then, how am I supposed to eat all of the meat of the korban pesach? V'basar she'al gabe ha'etzem. No, v'achlos abasu b'layla azeh means you got to eat the meat on the outside of the bones, but the meat on the inside of the bones you leave alone because you're not allowed to break the bones. O eno. Or maybe I can make the argument, maybe taka, when it says that you're going to eat the meat of the korban pesach, it means even the marrow, and you can break the bones in order to eat the marrow. Well, then what about the pasuk that says you're not allowed to break the bones? Yeah, that's davka talking about a bone that doesn't have marrow. I assume what it means that it doesn't have marrow in a particular place, but it has meat. It doesn't have meat, and it doesn't have meat on the outside. It doesn't have marrow on the inside. Then I think, like we said earlier, then what could be the problem? So I think what it means is that kilu, if you have a part of the bone that has no marrow, meaning I could theoretically argue that if you have a part of the bone that has no marrow inside and also no meat on the outside, well then I'm not allowed to break that. But if there is marrow, I can break it Meaning, if you have a part of, meaning, again, if the bone, I assume it means that if the bone has no marrow inside and has no meat on the outside, there won't be a problem. However, if you find a part of the bone that has no marrow in this part, but has some meat on the outside and some other part, so then you would be chayav. But if there is marrow inside, you would be potter because you have to eat the marrow, right? So again, right? So what do we say? Oh, eno ella. I'm going to back up 2 lines. Bebasar shebesocha etzem. Maybe when the pasuk says va'achlus habasar b'layla hazeh, it means that you eat the meat, even the marrow. So then what does it mean when it says you're not allowed to break the bones? When there's no marrow inside of it, so then you would not be allowed to break it. But if there is marrow, then break the bone and eat the marrow, because you have to eat the meat of the korban pesach. And don't think that that's such a big deal, because that we have a aseh, a positive commandment, and that's going to override the prohibition of etzem l'sish brubo. It's classic halacha. Aseh do chalosa aseh. So the question is, how do we learn it? No, friends, what do you think? Do we say that you're not allowed to break the bones in order to extract the marrow because of etzem l'sish brubo? Or do you think that you are allowed to break the bones to extract the marrow because of aseh do chalosa aseh? What do you guys think? Says the Gemara, Kshu omer ve'etzem lo yishbru bo b'pesach sheni, or, so says the Gemara, that in the context of Pesach sheni, it also says that you're not allowed to break the bones. Now, she'ein tamud lomar, it really doesn't need to say by Pesach sheni that you're not allowed to break the bones. Shari kvar nemar k'chochugat sa Pesach yasu oso, because it already says by Pesach sheni that you do the Pesach sheni in the same with all the halachas of the Pesach rishon. And one of the halachas by Pesach Rishon is ve'etzem lo sish brubo. You're not allowed to break any bones. So I know that memele, by the Pesach Sheni, you're not allowed to break any bones. So why does it say by the Pesach Sheni that also, it says over there you're not allowed to break any bones? Havi omer echad etzem sheyesh bo moach ve'echad etzem she'ein bo moach. It means whether the bone has marrow, whether the bone doesn't have marrow, you're not allowed to break it. So what do we see? So we see that even when a bone has marrow, you're not allowed to break it, that is also significant. And therefore, Rish Lakish is going to explain the initial brisa when it says, Ve'etzem l'sish brubo, it means that, meaning, when therefore, in the first brisa, when it says, Echad etzem sheyesh b'moach, ve'echad etzem she'ein b'moach, it means, no, Echad etzem sheyesh bo basar, ve'echad etzem she'ein bo basar. It means whether it has basar on the outside or whether it doesn't have basar meat on the outside, but it has marrow on the inside. In both of those cases, you'd be unable to break the bone. However, Rish Lakish would argue that if you found a part of the bone that has no marrow inside and no meat on the outside, well, then you would be allowed to break the bone. Argues Rish Lakish. Meisvei, we have a kasha. Ever sheyotzu miktzaso chotech ad makom shemagia le'etzem v'kolef ad shemagia le'ferg v'chotech. So we have a brayse that says Ever sheyotzu miktzaso. If you have a part of the korban pesach, that part of it went outside of Yerushalayim. So what do? Meaning part of it left the walls of Jerusalem, part of it was still remaining inside. So chotech ad makom shemagia le'etzem. So what you do is, you figure out which part of the limb left the walls of Jerusalem, and you take a knife and you cut down to the bone, and then you remove all of the meat from the bone and inside, all of the meat that was inside of Jerusalem, you then kind of like carve off of the bone until you get to like a joint, and then you cut the joint and then you can remove the like leg or whatever was Yotzei from Yerushalayim. So like let's say, let's use my arm as an example, right? So let's say my arm was like the arm of the korban pesach, and it left, let's say my hand left Jerusalem. So what you would do is you would take a knife, and I guess you would like cut my wrist down to my bones, and then, although the wrist maybe isn't a good example because then maybe you can just cut it right there. So let's say like my hand went outside plus a little bit of my forearm. So then, so like a little bit of my forearm until my wrist, and my entire hand was outside of Jerusalem. So what you would do is you would take a knife and you would cut down to my bone, where it like went outside of Jerusalem, and then you would scrape off all my meat from my forearm until we get to my elbow, and then you take a knife and you separate my forearm from the rest of my arm, and what are we talking about again? Right, so that's what the Mishnah that we're going to learn later is saying. So if you have part of the korban pesach that went outside of Jerusalem, so what you do is you basically find the part that went outside, and you take a knife, you cut down to the bone, and then you scrape away all of the kosher meat that remained inside of Jerusalem until you get to a joint where you can then just remove all of the entire arm, but all the kosher meat you will have removed. Now, Frekte Gemara. So, V'i Amart, now if you say Ever she'ein olav kazayis basar b'makom zeh v'yesh olav kazayis basar b'makom acher ein bo mishum shveras ha'etzem. Now if Rish Lakish is correct that a bone that has no meat at one part of it but has meat on another part of it, that's okay, you could still break it. Well then why do I have to remove all of the meat until we get to a joint? Lomali dekalef achmagia leferek v'chotech. Why do I have to remove all the meat until the joint? Niklov be porta. Just take your knife, go down to the bone, remove a little bit of meat until you have enough of like an area that has no meat on it. Now, if you're Rish Lakish, at that point, you can then just cut the bone. So Niklov be porta vinat bire. So Abaye Amar mishum paka Ravina Amar bekulis. So Abaye says, well, we're concerned that even if you theoretically make a din, you could break the bone over there. What if it ends up cracking in a different place? So even though make a din, it would be okay, but we have to be concerned that it might crack somewhere else. So therefore, we still don't want you to cut it, even though technically speaking, it won't be an isser, but it's too risky. Ravina says it's talking about the forearm of the animal that has marrow, and since it, Rish Lakish would say that, well, if there's meat on the inside, if there's marrow on the inside, well, then you would not be allowed to break the bone. Tanan Asam, we learn a little bit later on Daf Kuf Chof. HaPigul v'anoser. Pigul and noser. Pigul, of course, we know is a korban that you had intention to eat it outside of its allotted time. And noser is meat of a korban that wasn't eaten within its allotted time and it's left over. Mitamenes hayodayim, they make your hands tameh midirabanan. Stama to be a sheni letuma. Ravuna v'Rav Chizda charam pnei chashdei kuna v'charam pnei atzlei kuna. So if machlokas between Ravuna and Rav Chizda, one of them says that the reason why the chacham made exera to say that pigul and nosar make your hands tameh. So one opinion is that we're concerned about the chashdei kohan, right? That we're suspicious of the kohanim, and the other one is because the kohanim are lazy. Mar masnei pigul, mar masnei anoser. One of them is talking about pigul, and one of them is talking about noser. What this means is that the Manda Amar who says that it's talking about we're suspicious of the kohanim, that is in the context of pigul. And what that means is Rashi explains that I don't know, for some reason sometimes the kohanim would be upset at people and they would use their priestly powers to make their korban pigul. I guess if you're the one throwing the blood on the mizbeach, you can, I guess, just like throw it on the mizbeach with the intention of eating it outside of its proper time, and you just kind of messed up the korban. So the chachamim, as a remedy, they said, well, pigul is mitami esayodayim, and therefore if you, Mr. Cohen, have intention to eat this korban outside of its allotted time, well then it's going to become tameh midrabanan, it's going to be mitami yodayim, and then you're going to have to go wash up before touching any kachim, which is going to be inconvenient for the kohanim, and therefore they'll take their revenge on their friends in other ways. Uman, right, and then we said that the one who's says that we're concerned about the kohanim being lazy, that's in the context of noser, meaning they weren't chapping around and eating the korbanos on time, and there would be leftover korbanos that would become noser, and they would have to burn it. So in order to we want the kohen to eat the korbanos, not just let them go to waste. So to motivate the Kohanim to eat the korbanos, the meat of the korbanos, the Chacham made a gezerah that any noser would be matame your yadayim, would make your hands tame, and therefore that would be incentive to eat the meat so that it wasn't left over and be matame as a yadayim. Mamasnik zayis, mamasnik kibeya. One of them says that the shi'ur that we're talking about for both pigul and for nosar is the size of an olive. The other manda amar is that the measurement by pigul and by nosar is the size of an egg. Mandamasne kizayis ki isuro, mandamasne kibeitza ki tumoso. So the manda amar who says that the shi'ur for pigul and for nosar is a kizayis, well, that's like isuro. The amount that has to be pigul or nosar to be usr is a kizayis worth. So that's what we're talking about. And the manda amar who says that it's about right, that's the size of an egg, well, that's the size of tumaso, right? If you have, right, tumas ochlin is the size of an egg. Ibayluhu. Now, here's where we get to the question, Yotze gozu rabbanon tuma olo. What about Yotze? We said that by pigul and by noser, they're matame your yadayim. What about a korban that was taken outside where it's not allowed to go to? Right, let's say Kodshe Kodshim outside of the Hazar, Kodshim Kalim outside of Yerushalayim. So in that case, the korban becomes pasul. Is it matame your yadayim or not? Miamrinon, do we say noser tigazu tuma da'asil li'i atzule be? Do we say, well, when it comes to noser, when it comes to leftover meat that's not eaten on time, so I understand why we say that it's matame yadayim, as motivation, as incentive for the Kohanim to eat it and not be lazy and to eat it so that it won't come to be noser. Avol yotze, but in terms of yotze, a korban that is taken outside of the azara, let's say if it's kodshe kodshim, we don't have such a concern that we have to incentivize the Kohanim to not take it out of the azara. They're not doing that anyways. Afuku biyadayim lo mafkile biyadayim. They don't just take korbanos and bring them outside of the azara for no reason. So lo gazu be rabbanon tuma. So there was the rabbanon didn't feel the need to be gozer to make a gzera and make yotze tame because it's not really going to change anything. The Kohanim didn't have any reason to be taking it out of the azara in the first place. Odum aloshna. Or maybe there's no difference. Maybe just like the Chacham made a gzera that pigul and noser are matame yadayim, they made a similar gzera by yotze. This is what we're trying to figure out. Tashma, come in here. Aver shiyotze mikzaso. Back to this Mishnah that we saw a few lines ago and that we're going to see a little bit later. We're going to see the source of the Mishnah. That if you have this limb, that part of it was taken outside of whether it's Tazara or Jerusalem, wherever it's not allowed to go. So what do you do? So the part that was Yotze, the part that left, Chotech ad shemagia le'etzem. So at the point where it went where it's not supposed to go, you take a knife and you cut down to the bone. V'kol ad shemagia leferek. And then you scrape away all the meat until you get to a point where, to a joint. V'chotech, and then you cut the limb there at the joint. Now, v'yamad gazu b'rabbanon tuma. Well, if there's tuma by yotze, well then kichatech le mayhave hakametamile. Well, if we're saying that a korban that goes out of the place where it's allowed to go to becomes tameh, well then, what's the deal with cutting down to the bone and scraping away the meat that remained inside, by the korban pesach would be inside Jerusalem. But if we're saying that the part that left Jerusalem is tameh, well, if part of it becomes tameh, that part's gonna just make the whole korban tameh. So what's the point of, cutting down to the bone and scraping away? I mean, the whole thing is tameh, no? So Gemara answers Tumah Starmi. It's hidden Tumah. This isn't Tumah that you can really see. It's not like, Ruvain and Shimon, and then Ruvain's tameh and he touches Shimon and Shimon becomes tameh. This is kind of like, you can't really see exactly where the tumah spread to. It was just kind of like all one unit, and part of it became tameh and the rest of it became tameh, but like it's not like two separate things that are distinct from each other. V'tumah starim lo metamya, and hidden tumah does not be metameh. You need sort of distinct things to be metameh each other. What about according to Ravina? Ravina says that sort of the connections of food is not really considered a connection, and they're considered separate things, and therefore this animal, which is meat in this context, so the part that was yotze and is tameh is going to be considered distinct from the rest of the animal, and therefore you have the part that is tameh, the part that is tar, and they're touching each other as if they were two distinct items touching each other, and therefore the whole animal should be tameh. So what's the point of cutting down to the bone and scraping away? I mean, the whole animal's tameh anyways. So akanaga ba'adade, you have these two parts of the animal that are touching each other. V'kama tameh ella, the mandamasne kazayis delays be kazayis. So according to the Manda Amr, who says that the measurements that we're talking about over here are kazayis measurements by Pigul and by Nosar, well, he's going to say that, well, there was less than a kazayis of it that left Jerusalem. Mandamasne kibeya delays be kibeya. And the Manda Amr who says that the shear is the size of an egg, so then we're talking about where there was less than the size of an egg that left Jerusalem, and that is why it's not going to be matami the rest of the korban pesach. If you're Ravina, tashmakom in here. Hamotzi b'sar pesach michabura lechabura. Let's say you have, I think even in the same house we said, yeah, Rashi on the top of the next page, which is talking about a similar thing. And even if you're in one house, let's say, because there's a pasuk that says, right, what does the pasuk say? Who could tell me? No. V'achlu tzabasar b'layla zeh, no. L'yishim ben boker, no. There you go. B'vayis echad ye'achol. The pasuk says, b'vayis echad ye'achol, you have to eat the korban pesach in one house. Lo sotzi min habayis min habasar chutza, don't take the meat out of the house. V'etzem lo sishbu bo, and don't break any bones. So we see that you have to eat the korban pesach in one house. So let's say you have two korban pesachs in the same house, and you have one group on one korban pesach and another group on the other korban pesach. So not only are you not allowed to leave the house, you're also not allowed to go from one group to the other group. So tashma motzi b'sar pesach michabur lechabur. So let's say you have two korban pesachs happening in the same house. So you're not leaving the house, but you're going from one korban pesach to the other one, from one group to another group. Afapishu below saise tahor. So even though it's, you're taking meat from one place to another place, and in this context it would be considered like yotze, you're taking meat from one place to another place where you're not allowed to take it. So we're saying even though it's a lo ta'aseh, nonetheless it's tahor, it's pure. So my lav, how do we understand this? Tahor ve'asur, meaning it's pure even though it's forbidden. That a fellow who takes meat from one of the korban pesach from one group to another group is similar to somebody who takes meat of a korban outside of where it's allowed to go. Umafsil, and we're saying that this meat is pasul. And even so, we're saying that it's tar alma logazu rabbanon tuma. So we see that the rabbis did not decree that there should be tumah for meat that leaves a place where it's supposed to be, because we see that you're taking the meat from one chabur to another chabur, so it's yotze, right? You're taking it out from where it's supposed to be to where it's not supposed to be, and yet we're saying that it's tahor. Lo, the Gemara says no, tahor umutter. It's talking about that this meat is tahor and it's permitted. Taking meat from one group to another group, the meat of a korban pesach from one group to another group is not like taking, let's say, I don't know, a korban chatas outside of the azara. Velo mafsil, and this meat is not pasul. Period. It's not pasul, and that's why it's tahor. It's not similar to yotze, but theoretically yotze, I could still argue that it would be tameh. Vakatani seifa. But one second, what if we continue reading in this brisa? Ha'ochlo harize below saise. that if you eat this meat that you took from one chabura to another chabura, if you eat it, you're violating a prohibition. What prohibition? Sounds like taking this meat from one group to another group would be the lo taseh of yotzei, of taking meat outside of where it's allowed to go. That's the lo taseh, that's the prohibition. And still we're saying that it's tahor. So it sounds like taking, yotzei by korbanos would be tahor. So b'shlomo l'man da'omer kibetza, the izbei kazayis v'leizbei kibetza. So I understand, according to Mandam, who says that kibetza, right? We had a machlokas earlier, right? When it came to pigol and nosar, is it talking about a kazayis or talking about a kibetza? So if we want to argue that taking a korban outside of where it's allowed to go is mitame yadayim, well, then how do we explain this case where you took some meat from one group to another group and we're saying that it's tahor? Well, we could say that it's talking about where you took a kazayis from one group to another group, and that's why it's pasul. That's why you're violating a lo ta'aseh of taking it from one place to another place. Yet it's tahor because it's less than the size of an egg's worth, and tumas ochlin only kicks in at the size of an egg's worth. Although, I think we say that food can become tameh less than an egg's worth. It just doesn't transfer tumah. I guess you would have to say that as well. That when we say that it's tahor milit tameh, that it won't transmit tumah to other things. Okay, fine. But if you say that we're talking about a kazayis and we're saying that it's tahor, well then it's going to be hard to argue that there's tumah when it comes to yotzei, because here we have a situation where you're taking this meat somewhere else, which is yotzei, and still we're saying it's tahor. So ella biyotzei b'pesach lo mibayalan lo gazur abanan tumah. So no, when it comes to korban pesach, the rabbis didn't feel the need to make a gezerah and say that if you take meat from one group to another group, it's going to be tameh. Why? My time outcome, b'nei chabur is reasoning. Because the people in the group eating the korban pesach, they're very zreason. They're on top of things. They're excited. Whatever, they're very meticulous. Right? They have the group, they're excited, they bring the korban pesach, everyone knows the halachas, and it's like, hey, don't go there, I don't know, what's an example? I feel like we have an example, there are examples of these things where people kind of, matzah baking maybe. You go to matzah baking, all of a sudden there's like mumchis about it, people know, don't do this, do that, everyone's like, you got the stopwatch, everyone's very makbid to make sure nothing's going to go wrong. So it's like that also by the korban pesach, right? And therefore the chacham didn't feel the need to say, if you take meat from one group to another group, it's going to be tameh. Because everyone's going to be reminding each other, right? Don't get up, everyone just stay here once you get the meat, this is what we're going to do, right? What we want to know is by kodshim. In general, the truth is we say kohanim zrizin, hein also, which is actually interesting. And I think we actually saw somewhere that kohanim are even more zrizin than the people of the chabura. Where did we see that? Who could tell me? We saw somewhere in Pesachim, I think, that anytime Dick and Harry is going to be bringing a korban pesach, but the kohanim are zrizin, I think. But anyways, what about by kodshim? Do we make the gezerah of tumah by kodshim? My teku, we don't know. After all that, we don't know. If you take some kodshim where it doesn't belong, whether it's kodshim out of the Azorah or kodshim kalim out of Yerushalayim, is it tameh? With the Rabbanon goes there, tumah? We don't know. Umotzi b'sar pesach michabur lechabur minayin. How do I know that if you take some of the meat, the flesh of the korban pesach from one group to another group, that it's a lav, that it's a problem? The Tanya is, we learn in the Brayso, lo sotzi min abayis min abasar chutza. Do not take any of the meat of the korban pesach outside of the house that you are in. All I know is don't take the meat out of the house that you're eating it in into another house. What if you're eating it outside? Michabur lechabur minayin. How do I know that even within one house, if there are two korban pesachs, I can't take the meat from one korban pesach to another group, korban pesach group, from one group to another group? Tamlomer chutza achilaso. Right, it says losotzim min abas min abayis chutza. Doesn't really need to say chutza. So what do we learn out from that word chutza? It means chutz la'achilaso, outside of the specific place where you are eating it. Okay, now we're gonna get to some familiar things. I wonder how you're gonna feel. If you're gonna feel nostalgic, if after being a few months away from Shabbos and Eruvin, it's gonna feel a little bit comfortable to very sort of on an elementary level reference the basics of Hotzah. Amr Ba'ami says, Ba'ami Amotzi B'sar Pesach Mechabur Lechabura. Somebody who is Motzi, Hotzah, somebody who takes the meat of a korban pesach from one group to another group, and uchayvet she'aniach. You have to have an akira and an anocha. So if you take the meat from one group to another group, you have to have an akira from one group and anocha in the other group. Very, very, very nice. So you have to pick up the meat from one group, take it over to the other group, and put it down, just like the ani and the Baal Habayis in the first Mishnah of Masechta Shabbos. Okay, fine. Hotzah ksivbe, because after all, it says in the context of Korban Pesach, it says Hotzah, right? It says lo sotzi min abayis min abasar, it says Hotzah. So kishabbos, it's just like Hotzah on Shabbos, ma Shabbos, adav akir v'anocha, af ochonami adav akir v'anocha. Just like on Shabbos, as we know in our sleep, that there has to be an akira in one rishus and anacha in another rishus. So here also, there has to be an akira in one group and an anacha in another group. Mosav Rabbi Abba Bar Mamel, that is not a name that you see every day. Rabbi Abba Bar Mamel asks the question, are you sovlim osan b'motos? So when it comes to, now recently we've been referencing these korbanos like the korban helam davar shel tzibor, the korban par Mashiach. These are korbanos that, like korban chatases, that are entirely burnt outside of all three camps. Now, once already you schlep it outside of one camp, already it's metame bigadim. The people who are schlepping it out, their clothing becomes tames. Now, we have a brisa that says, "Are you sovlim osan b'motos?" If you were schlepping this ox, this cow, on like poles, so you had a few people schlepping this heavy dead carcass. Harishonim yatsu chutz l'chom asazar. Once already the first people, the people taking the lead, left the azara, v'achronim lo yatsu, and the people in the back have not yet left the azara, they're still in the azara. Harishonim mitamin bigadim v'achronim ein mitamin bigadim. At that point already, the rishonim, the people who have left at the front, at the lead, who have left the azara, their mitami bigadim, their clothing becomes tame already. Now, over there also, it says in the context, ve'otziu, that they, right, hotzah as well. Now, ve'alo nach, but it hasn't rested yet, they're walking, they're on the move. There was no hanacha. So, most of lavu mefarik la b'nigrarin. So, Rabbi Abba Bar Mabel asked the kasha, he also answered the kasha that it's talking about where they were dragging the ox on the floor, and therefore it was like it kind of landed because it was dragging on the floor. Alright. Very nice. Alright, we're up to a new Mishnah. Aver sheyatz mitzasel chotech hat shemageh le'etzim v'kolef hat shemageh le'perek v'chotech. Right, okay. We saw this is the third time we're seeing this Mishnah today. You have an aver sheyatz mitzasel, if you have a limb, that part of it left the walls of where it shouldn't go, whether it's Tazar, whether it's Yerushalayim, kachim kalim. So you cut the meat until you get to the bone, and then you scrape away the meat until you get to the joint, and then remove the limb. And now, when it comes to other kachim, where there is no prohibition against breaking the bones, well then pashit kotes bekupitz she'ein bo mishum shviras etzim. So you can just hack off the part of the limb that was yotze with a. We saw a kupitz the other day, in terms of if you find a kupitz like on Erev Pesach, can you assume that it went to the mikveh or not? I think we saw it in the context of the chagiga. Can you break the bones of the chagiga? Anyways, So when it comes to other korbanos, where there's no issue with breaking the bones, so then you would just hack off the part of the bone that was yotze. Fine. We have a guest here. Oh yeah, I'm not sure where she is. No, sorry. No, it's okay. Cool. Yeah, we had a guest here on Babylon Talmud. Alright, let's go weiter. I don't know what I was talking about, but if you have part of the limb that's yotze, so then you can just hack it off when it comes to other korbanos. Weiter. Mina agav v'lifnim kilifnim. I don't know let me make sure I just read it. Muktashim kotzes v'kubis she'ebu mishum shvetz ha'etzem, right? Because other korbanos don't have any problem with breaking the bones. Weiter. Mina agav v'lifnim kilifnim. What does this mean? So this is now talking about the gates of Jerusalem, okay? So let's say we're talking about Kodshim Kalim. Let's say we're talking about the korban pesach. So the korban pesach you can eat anywhere in Jerusalem. Now, what about the gates of Jerusalem? So now if you look at a door, if you go and look at your door right now, so there's likely a part of the door that when the door is closed, it takes up that part of the doorpost, and then there's a part where like the door kind of hits against. That's like, I guess it kind of smacks against it. So when the door is closed, the part of the doorpost that the door is covering, I don't know what that's called in technical terms. So anyways, from the inner part of the door, not that part, from the part before. So like if you're, how about this? Let's say you're inside of Jerusalem and you're looking at the door that you're going to walk through to leave Jerusalem, okay? So once you get to like the first part of that door, we're talking about before the part of the door that the door when it's closed covers, right? Meaning right before that, when you get like up to that point. So from that point and inwards is part of Jerusalem. And then when you go to the other side of this doorpost thing, from that part and outside is going to be considered outside of Jerusalem. And as Rashi points out, we're not really telling you how do we deal with the part of the doorway where like the door kind of covers when it's closed. I hope that was a good enough explanation. So let's read the Mishnah. Mina agav v'lifnim kilifnim. So from like the beginning of the doorpost and inside of Jerusalem is considered like inside of Jerusalem. Mina agav v'lachutz kilachutz. And from like the end of the doorpost, I guess you can call it, and outside is considered outside of Jerusalem. Hachalonus v'ovi achoma. The windows in the walls of Jerusalem, as well as the top of the walls of Jerusalem, kilifnim, are all considered like inside of Jerusalem. Nafkaminis, for like kachim kalim, if you eat the korban, if the korban pesach is yotze, things like that. Can you eat the korban pesach in these places? Says the Gemara, Amar Yehuda, Amar Rav, v'chein letfila. Similarly, says Rav Yehuda, Amar Rav, that the same thing applies to tefillah. If you want to daven in a minyan, and you're in a room and there's a doorpost, so if you want to be part of the minyan, you have to be within the room, within the doorpost, says Rav. Now, ufliga de Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, this taka argues on Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, the Amar Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, afilu mechitza shel barzel, enu hafsekes ben Yisrael lavim shebashamayim, even a partition of iron is unable to make a separation between the Yidden and their Father in heaven. Wow. Hagu fakasha. Now, frekti Gemara, this is inherently a problem. On the one hand, Amar mina agav v'lifnim kilifnim. On the one hand, we said that from sort of the point of the door, from the beginning of like that doorpost and inside Jerusalem is considered like inside of Jerusalem, ha'agav atzmo kilachutz, which implies that the doorpost itself, the doorway itself, would be considered outside of Jerusalem. Ema seifa, but then if we continue reading in the Mishnah, it says, mina agav v'lachutz kilachutz, that from sort of the end of the doorpost, the doorway, and outside is considered outside of Jerusalem, ha'agav atzmo kilifnim. But the doorway itself is considered like inside of, Jerusalem, or as we're going to see, maybe the Azara, whatever the doorpost is for, so we're getting mixed messages about the sort of the thickness of the doorway itself. Is it considered like inside or outside? Lo kasha. no problem. Kam b'shari Azara, kam b'shari Yerushalayim. It depends if we're talking about the gates of the Azara or the gates of Jerusalem. When it comes to the gates of Jerusalem, the thickness of the doorway is considered like outside of Jerusalem, as we're going to see in a second, because mitzoras used to hang out there to get like protection from the sun or the shade. And in the Azara, the thickness of the walls are considered like part of the Azara. Is that yes, that's correct. Yeah. Damar Rav Shmuel bar Rav Yitzchak, that Rav Shmuel bar Rav Yitzchak says, "Ma lo niskadchu shari Yerushalayim." How come the doorways of Jerusalem were not holy with the holiness of Jerusalem, that they're considered like outside of Jerusalem? Because the mitzoras, who are obviously tameh, and we learned are sent out of all the camps, i.e. outside of Jerusalem, so they would sort of get shelter in the doorway. In the summer to get protection from the sun, and in the winter to get protection from the rain. How come specifically the gate of Nicanor was not holy with the holiness of Jerusalem? Because when the Mitzoras get their purification, they stand there and put their thumbs in there. What does this mean? Inside, so in the Azara, you could probably find a diagram, but the Azara was like where the Mizbech HaChitzon was, things like that, and there were a number of gates that went into the Azara. So those gates, the thickness of the gates had the holiness of the Azara. The one exception being Shar Nicanor, which was the gate on the eastern side of the Azara, and the Mitzoras, when they're no longer have tzaras, and they wait another week, we confirm they don't have any tzaras, and then on day 8, they come and bring korbanos and stuff, and then they go to Shar Nicanor and they stick their hands through Shar Nicanor so that some of like the blood of the ashram can go on their hands and stuff. So because they have to stick their hands through Shar Nicanor, so specifically Shar Nicanor was not, the thickness of it is not kadosh with the kedushas Azara, but all the other gates of the Azara, it would be holy with the holiness of the Azara. So the gates of Jerusalem do not have the holiness of Jerusalem because the Mitzoras hang out there. The gates of Nicanor, the gate of Nicanor also did not have the holiness. One second. The gates of Jerusalem do not have the holiness of Jerusalem. The gates of the Azara generally do have the holiness of the Azara, the exception being Shar Nicanor, because that is where the Mitzoras hang out as part of the purification process. That was Daf Pehei of Masechta Pesachim. I think it was an interesting daf. Can anybody confirm? What did we discuss? We discussed breaking bones with if you have a bone that part of it has meat, part of it doesn't have meat. Rabbi Yochanan says you're not allowed to break it. Reish Lakish says, wait a second. If there's marrow inside, then sure, I agree, you're not allowed to break it. But if there's no meat in this part of the bone and there's no marrow either, you'd be allowed to break it. We discussed the sugya about tumas yadayim for yotze. So the conclusion that we got over there was that when it comes to korban pesach, there's no tumas yadayim. If you take meat from one korban pesach, if one group to another group, it's going to be tahor. The question is, what about when it comes to korbanos? What if you take a piece of korban chatas out of the azara? Is it going to be metamei sayadayim? It's going to make your hands tamei. We said take it, we don't know. And then we got up to this new Mishnah. The first part of the Mishnah discussed something that came up a few times today, which is that if part of the korban pesach is yotze from Yerushalayim, so you basically cut down to the bone and then scrape away until the joint and then cut it. And then we got up to an interesting Gemara that the sort of doorways of Jerusalem are considered like outside of Jerusalem because the Mitzoras hang out there. The doorways of the Azara are generally considered with the whole, like they have the holiness of the Azara. The one exception being the gate of Nicanor, since the Mitzoras would have to stand there as part of the purification process and stick their hands through. Friends, I very much enjoyed learning with you. I hope you enjoyed learning with me. Have a great day. Peace out.